Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so I know this is going to sound really strange, but we're covering DCeased. Now, here's the thing. We're covering DCeased, the Unkillables, right? So this is a 3-issue miniseries, and it's going to be monthly, right? So the next one's not going to come out until March 18th at the time that we're recording this video. But it looks like Tom Taylor and DC are expanding on the DCeased universe, right? They're expanding on this whole story, which kind of makes sense, right? Like, it's one of the things that people who read Marvel Zombies kind of got this feeling of, okay, we think they're going to start expanding and giving us more stuff. And that looks like what they're doing, right? How far this expansion is going to go, we don't know, right? I mean, I think we still have the follow-up story to Constantine and all that kind of stuff. And then basically this answers the question of what the villains were doing. But this one specifically focuses on the Red Hood, right? So what this does, it initially picks up with Deathstroke, picks up with Slade Wilson. And it's actually one of the coolest things, right? Because Slade Wilson has basically been hired for $9 million to kill a whole bunch of guys who have essentially taken out a church, right? I mean, the guys, committed a violent act against a church. And so Deathstroke's been paid $9 million to essentially get the revenge. The problem is when he shows up here, one of the guys is jumping out with shattered legs and is just like running for his life, but then comes to the realization this guy was running from something, right? Because as soon as that happens, the door comes crashing open and there's all these people who come running out as well, and Deathstroke starts going to kill them, only to realize, okay, there's a bigger issue at play here. What he ends up realizing is that this house is basically filled with zombies. Now again, Deathstroke, despite all the abilities that he has and the technology he usually has at his disposal, once he goes on a mission, his only concern is that mission, right? So we can largely go with the idea that he's been oblivious to what's going on. This is especially important because this is day one, right? The outbreak just happened. The infection just took hold. So it's really one of these things where it's like he, alongside so many other people, are just now being caught up in it, but he doesn't really look at his phone all the time. What he's doing is he's basically like carrying out his missions. And so as a result of that, as soon as he gets in here, of course, he basically starts going through and trying to kill these guys. But as we know, it's very, very difficult to do that, right? Shooting them doesn't really work. That instead you kind of have to like decapitate them or something along those lines. But then ultimately Deathstroke ends up looking at his phone, realizing, being like, okay, like time to basically say, all right, let's follow up with this. Like we gotta get this sorted out so that payment can be increased essentially or something like that, only for Deathstroke to be infected with the virus. And so when that happens, he starts to go on a warpath, but then suddenly his healing factor starts to kick in, right? And where he had basically made his way into the city and was essentially taking everybody out, once his healing factor kicked in, then it purged the virus from his body, right? So this is the first real instance that we see that the virus can be cured, something that Cyborg had basically figured out at the end of the story, or at least at the end of the main DC story, before he was killed by Wonder Woman. And so what this does is then it switches over to Jason Todd. And that was the big question people had, right? People wanted to know what happened to Red Hood during DCeased. What was he doing? Like, was he one of the first to fall? We just never found out. What was going on with Red Hood? And so by the time we get into day 2, Red Hood, presumably, we don't really know what he was doing during day 1. We can largely assume that he figured out what was going on and then came to the Batcave to basically figure out, to talk to Batman or whoever and see if anybody has any idea, only to come across the bodies of Dick Grayson and Damian Wayne and Batman and essentially find out that like they're dead. And so with that being the case, of course, then he's met by the arrival of Ace the Bat Hound, which we're glad to see he's alive. Ace the Bat Hound is also kind of a alarm system to a degree, right? And it's a really smart move by Tom Taylor because Ace can really kind of be used as like an early warning system of like an infected, right? So like if they go into an area, they walk up to a building, and because dogs, sense of smell is so keen, then he can pick up on the fact that there's infected there, then it's kind of an early monitoring system. Okay, tread carefully or let's leave, right? So, basically, using some wood, he ends up carving out some gravestones and ultimately ends up, using the Batmobile to find the heartbeats of the various members of the Bat family in Gotham City, and only finds 2. Now, despite his separation from his family, it's also an important thing to understand that over the course of DC Comics, it's been well established that Slade, for the most part, loves his family. It's his idea to keep them safe, especially Rose, right? And so the idea here, at least what we end up really seeing go down here, is of course she gets a call from Slade, and Slade says like, it's time to go, we have to leave. And Rose responds by saying, no, that's not going to work because I've seen the future, and every time I open the front door, I end up dying. Now, here's the important thing to understand about Rose's precognition. It's not precognition in the traditional sense, meaning she's not actually seeing the future. The way her mind works is it basically takes the situation as best she understands it, and then it arranges and gives her the most likely outcome, right? So literally it's just mathematical probability is more or less how her brain functions. It's just really, really, really accurate most of the time. Of course, Slade Wilson basically chimes in and just says, no, go onto the rooftop. You're not going to be stuck, where she starts to freak out. She thinks she's going to get stuck on the rooftop. The response to Slade is, no, you're not. Everything's going to be fine. And so she gets to the rooftop, a ladder drops down, down, and then Slade's met by the arrival of Man-Bat. And it's kind of cool to see these characters that we never saw during the original DCeased story, right? The idea of Man-Bat coming cruising in, you know, and then just like going to attack Slade, the helicopter ends up crashing. Now, of course, Man-Bat's killed in the explosion, and initially, you know, Rose comes to the conclusion that Slade himself is infected, and then goes to stab him. And then when Slade says, ow, then it's just kind of like, okay, my bad. But basically, that's when we kind of get this confirmation that essentially the healing factor of Slade Wilson is what keeps the anti-life infection, more or less, from taking him over. You know, it keeps the virus from turning him and keeping him into one of them, that his body can quite literally fight it off, right? And so what we end up doing is we end up having an appearance of Mirror Master. And the reality is that Mirror Master is probably the one character in all of DC Comics, at least as far as Earth-based characters, who would be most likely to be completely unharmed, right? Because the guy can basically exist, like he can bounce through mirrors, right? That's his whole idea, is to see and talk to people through mirrors, to leave the mirrors if he chooses to. And so he's literally the one guy who could just be fine. He could go inside mirrors and then always be safe there. And whenever he needed food or water or anything like that, then in turn, just jump from one location to the next, right? He could always find a way out. But what he says is, there is a collection of villains who have survived, right? There's a collection of villains who were there. I can take you to them. You know, your presence has been requested by Vandal Savage. There's an offer that he's bringing to the table. Wear these goggles, come with us. These goggles will basically prevent the anti-life equation from taking you over. But you might want to close your eyes as we're passing through this mirror dimension, right? Because when they walk through that realm, all they see are just mirrors everywhere that just show like dead bodies, right? Dead bodies, people turning, different things like that, just how bad the infection is. And that's when we pick up with Vandal Savage. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because as I was reading this, Vandal Savage never really crossed my mind when I was reading the original DCeased story, right? I was reading that and it never occurred to me that Vandal Savage has been around for an exceedingly long amount of time, and that Vandal Savage would, while he wouldn't necessarily have planned for this, he would know how to cope with the situation. And that's basically what he says here, right? He says, one, I've been around this world for a very, very long time. This is not my first extinction event. And two, the heroes are going to fail because the heroes they're not able to do what they need to do. They're not ruthless enough to do what needs to be done in order to win. And we know that's true because we've seen how DCeased plays out. Instead of focusing their efforts on eradicating the virus and eradicating everybody who's infected, instead they focus their efforts on protecting people and putting people into a safe location. The result was that they made probably one of the worst decisions they could have made, and they consolidated all the superheroes down into one location so that when one of those heroes became infected, then they knew where everybody else was, right? So it was probably one of the worst and biggest blunders the superheroes possibly could have made in that situation. In reality, they should have just spread out, but maintained contact through like walkie-talkies or something like that, you know, some method of communication that was essentially old school, but wouldn't actually reveal where their location was. Nonetheless, we end up finding this surviving group here is composed of some pretty interesting characters, right? We've got Solomon Grundy, we've got the Creeper, who can heal from pretty much anything. You've got Bane, you've got Lady Shiva, you've got Deadshot, you've got Captain Cold, you've got Cheetah, which I don't even know why she's there, but you've got a collection of some pretty interesting characters here. And so what you end up doing is you jump back over to Jason Todd, right? And this is really the meat and potatoes. This is really what you guys kind of came to see with regards to this DCeased event, is Jason Todd picking up in Gotham, right? It's night 2 of the anti-life virus. And one thing to understand is that for the most part, we're not really going to see much of Slade Wilson for the rest of this story. We're not really going to see him at all. Instead, the rest of this really focuses exclusively on Jason Todd. And so what we end up having is Jason Todd showing up to Gotham City Police Department, talking to Jim Gordon, or at least arriving on the scene when all hell's breaking loose. And one of the things that they intended to do, you know, Jim Gordon and Harvey Bullock, was to basically fall back to the cells, right? Because this is all just kind of popped off. And where Batman hasn't shown up yet, the idea was that Batman will show up eventually, right? Like Batman will arrive here at some point along the line. But the issue is that he hasn't arrived yet, presumably because he's tied up with the infection just like everybody else. But Batman will be here. That's the philosophy, that's the ideology of Harvey Bullock and Jim Gordon. And so it's like, fall back to the cells, it'll buy us time for when Batman gets here, and Batman will save us. Now, Harvey Bullock's infected in the meantime, and then of course, you know, you end up having his neck broken by this member of the Bat family who's there, but the member of the Bat family's not really talking to anybody, right? And that should be a first clue as to who this person is. And so in the middle of all that, you know, you end up having like the wall that smashes down. Jim Gordon's like, oh my God, it's Batman, you saved us. Some of the zombies are shot in the head, and then Red Hood comes out and says, no, I'm not Batman. Batman's not coming. Batman's gone. Batman's dead, right? And it's one of the most crushing things to hear when you're Jim Gordon, because it's just like, what in the heck, right? Because initially, like, his immediate response is where Red Hood says, like, we have to leave Gotham. We got to get the hell out of this place. The city's fallen. There's nothing to save here. The response to Jim is, no, we have to save my daughter, Barbara. And at that point, Red Hood chimes in and says, no, your Barbara's gone. Like, Barbara Gordon is gone. She's dead. And Jim Gordon's like, well, then I need to know, right? I need to know for sure. The heartbeat's pulled up, her heartbeat is basically flatlined. Red Hood ends up taking Jim Gordon to Barbara Gordon. We also find out this is Cassandra Cain, who's basically the last surviving member of the Bat family, which seems pretty appropriate given how well of a fighter she is, how good she is at hiding, sneaking, being in the shadows, things like that. She'd be able to keep herself well hidden from everything else going on. But essentially, once they travel and they locate the body of Barbara Gordon, of course, it's all stringed up. We know that from what Harley Quinn had done when she had faced off against all of them. And basically with Barbara Gordon's death confirmed, Jason Todd then turns his attention to the Joker. And Jason Todd's pissed off. Joker was killed before Jason could get to him. And so one of the cool things that you get out of this, Jason Todd, what he ends up doing, and probably one of the coolest aspects here, one of the coolest things, is in order to get his revenge, he basically takes the body of the Joker and straps it to the front of the Batmobile, and it's just like, let's go, like the Bat tank, and it's just like, let's go, like we're getting out of Gotham City. And so what they end up doing is traveling to Bludhaven on day 3 of the anti-life fires. And the reality is that Bludhaven has fallen. And you get this kind of funny thing, right, where Jason Todd's like, it's almost kind of an improvement. But at the end of the day, Jason Todd is ruthless, right? Jason Todd will do whatever he feels needs to be done in order to ensure his own survival in a situation like this. And he basically looks at Bludhaven and says, the place has fallen, right? The place has fallen. There's really nothing we can do here. Now you do end up having, all these zombies surrounding one particular building, and the response is, okay, there's people in there, but Jason Todd wants to leave. Jason Todd's like, let's go. The response to Jim Gordon is, no, we have to save who's there. We're the good guys. It's what we do. And this is what Vandal Savage is referring to when he says that the good guys are half measures. The good guys aren't really able to do what needs to be done in order to save the world. And so Jason Todd basically disengages the safety protocols on the Bat tank, fires rockets, takes out a whole bunch of those guys, and then when he shows up there, he ends up realizing it's housing a whole bunch of orphans. Ultimately, Jason Todd ends up siding with the orphans and is kind of like, okay, orphans got to stick together. And so how many of these kids are going to survive? We don't really know. But it really kind of seems to be going in the direction of this story, the fact that the first issue didn't really introduce anybody other than like Jason Todd, Jim Gordon, and Cassandra Cain, as well as, these orphan kids who were here, as well as Slade Wilson, his daughter, and the various villains who survived. It looks like this DCeased, villains story, Unkillables, is going to be confined to this. This is really all it's going to be. So anyway, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. Okay, I want to give a shout out to Kyle B, David Joseph, Ben, John H, AJ, Matt N, Jeff R, John H, Lean and Mean, which is an awesome name, Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, Joey M, Steven Z, Austin B, Adam K, and Genosis 916. Remember, guys, you can send me messages and I'll run off whatever your message is at the end of the video, so long as it's nothing crazy. But if you want to put a message in there, send me an email, rob@robertjefferson.com, and if you are one of these people who gets shout outs, then I will tack it in there. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys.